Hello and welcome back to our online lecture series on economics. Today we're going to talk about, in this video, we're going to talk about Phillips curve. Previously we examined relationships between interest, inflation, employment, production. So if you haven't seen that video, please go and watch that video because it is going to be critical in understanding the basic logical relationships that exist between such different economic parameters. So Phillips curve essentially is a theory that says that there is an inverse relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. We can also say that there is a direct relationship between employment rate and inflation. What does that mean? Well, it simply means that as the rate of employment increases, or if the rate of unemployment falls, that means here, if you're going in this direction, unemployment is lower. That means employment is higher. So please don't get confused. Unemployment is the exact opposite of employment. Okay. So why is that the case? Well, considering the fact that we already know the relationship between interest rate and prices, price level, production, aggregate demand for factors of production, aggregate demand for goods and services owing to higher incomes if the interest rate falls, owing to lower incomes if the interest rate rises. This relationship we have already understood. So in that light, it will be very easy to understand what Phillips curve means. So let's see. This vertical axis is for inflation rate, horizontal axis for unemployment rate. As you can see, this curve is called as, it's convex to the origin and it's falling, and obviously it has a slope. Why is this slope negative? Well, it's negative slope because it's falling like this. Okay, we call this kind of downward sloping curve as negative slope. The simple reason is that in order to get something, if you increase this, then you have to decrease this. So an increase in this entails a decrease in this, hence a negative relationship. What would be a positive relationship? Well, this kind of stuff. This kind of curve will be a positive curve or a positive relationship between these two variables. So Phillips curve is negatively sloping and it's an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation rate. Why? Well, the idea is this. As we previously examined, that if the rate of employment increases, means that people have incomes. Okay, so income of people increases when the employment increases. Okay, we can denote this with Y. Okay, generally it's denoted output or income, generally denoted as Y. So incomes of people increase when the employment increases or the unemployment falls. When the incomes of people increase, what are they going to do? They're going to buy, or rather demand, more goods and services. When they demand more goods and services, demand for goods and services, okay, that increases, which ultimately puts pressure on prices, as we have already seen in the last video. And if it puts pressure on prices, the term we use for general rise in price level is inflation. So that is why there is, so it's a very simple exposition of the relationship between employment and inflation, okay, or unemployment and inflation. Now there have been several refutations of Phillips curve because it does not really hold true the way it is posited in theory. The data, if you look at, you can go to any portal and just overlay the inflation figures on the employment figures, and you will understand that there is hardly a correlation of somewhere around 38 to 40%. Okay, so if the correlation, or rather the coefficient of regression line, or the slope is merely 38%, it is related, but it's not related in such a way which would be statistically significant. So later economists actually came to the conclusion that Phillips curve doesn't really hold true. So they came with the idea, they came up with the idea called as long run Phillips curve. Okay, long run Phillips curve. Well, they say long run Phillips curve is basically a straight vertical line, which simply means that in the long run, the trade-off between unemployment and inflation, that actually stops. Why? Because in the long run, economies generally tend towards natural rate of unemployment. Okay, natural rate of natural rate of unemployment or natural rate of employment, whichever you want to call it. So in that case, the labor supply is not really flexible. It's a vertical line, that it doesn't matter how much inflation rate is, it doesn't really affect the unemployment rate. One thing here, it is very important to consider that inflation rate is not merely a reflection of employment rate. Inflation rate could simply change because of several factors. Okay, so the most common example given as the change in oil prices, for example. What is change in oil price? Well, what is oil? Oil is basically a factor of production. Okay, it's used as an input in an industry or production. So it is nothing but factor of production, and if it increases because of some international instability, right, that simply doesn't mean that there's going to be a higher production, there's going to be higher employment. It simply means that the price levels have actually shifted. That's all it means. So without even, let's say, if the relationship holds true, frankly speaking, at the same curve, that relationship will not hold true anymore, because the price levels have been artificially inflated. Okay, so Phillips curve is just a mechanism to understand the relationship between these two variables, but it doesn't tell you much. But does that mean that there is no relationship? Absolutely not. There is definitely a relationship, because we have seen that when the consumption increases in an economy, okay, that could give rise to inflation. But inflation can also happen because certain other factors. So there is no one-to-one relationship, but in fact it's one-to-many or many-to-many relationships. Okay. So we'll conclude our lecture on Phillips curve. Thank you.